Hello students, welcome my friend channel. Here I am giving me answers for the multiple choice question practice sets given on my website. Here instead of mentioning direct answers for the questions, answers are made bold. So please mind the font difference to get the answers for the questions. This article to read. Foundation course. Set 2 Sybcom. Same 3. Unit 2 MCQ for practice. K. Choose correct option for the answer. 1. There is a conscious effort being made for disaster risk reduction at blank level. A. National. B. Provincial. C. Sub-provincial. D. All of the above. 2. Disaster is an event which strikes blank and changes lives of all that it touches. A. Suddenly. B. Slowly. C. Very slowly. D. Uncertainly. 3. Due to blank floods have become more frequent and severe. A. Deforestation. B. Afforestation. C. Overgrazing. D. Rainwater harvesting. 4. After blank there are threat of waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, gastroenteritis, etc. A. Floods. B. Earthquakes. C. Volcanoes. D. Bushfires. 5. Due to erratic nature of monsoon, blank, have become too much frequent in Indian subcontinent. A. Tsunami. B. Earthquakes. C. Droughts. D. Landslides. 6. Destruction of blank has resulted in heavy losses at coastal areas in 2004 tsunami in India. A. Grasses. B. Sandbars. C. Mangroves. D. Aquatic organisms. 7. Some of the major effects of droughts are 1. Deficiency in rate of increase of groundwater recharge. 2. Land degradation. 3. Loss of biomass. 4. Forced migration of people leading to conflicts. Which of the above statement is correct? A. 1, 2 and 3. B. 2, 3 and 4. C. 1, 2 and 4. D. 1, 2, 3 and 4. 8. Some of the major effects of flood are 1. Soil pollution. 2. Mixing of sewage water with groundwater. 3. Loss of human lives, animals and shelter. 4. Deficiency in groundwater recharge. Which of the above statements are incorrect? A. 1, 2 and 4. B. 2 and 3. C. 2, 3 and 4. D. 1, 2, 3 and 4. 9. Grassland forests are threatened by 1. Expansion of agriculture. 2. Oil spill. 3. Increased grazing by livestock. 4. Forest fires. Which of the above statements are incorrect? A. 1, 3 and 4. B. 1, 2 and 4. C. 2 and 3. D. 2. 10. Disaster mitigation measures include blank. A. Awareness program. B. Land use planning. C. Infrastructure design and location. D. Zoning. 11. The contents of disaster mitigation plans vary depending on 1. Geographical location. 2. Type and nature of disaster. 3. Technological and economic conditions. 4. Data regarding prior history of disaster obtained from Meteorological Department. Which of the following statements are correct? A. 1, 2 and 4. B. 2 and 4. C. 1, 2, 3 and 4. D. 1 and 3. 12. Blank occurs when anthropogenic actions allow increased damages from natural or man-made disasters. A. Natural disaster. B. Man-made disaster. C. Hybrid disaster. D. Climatic disaster. 13. Occurrence of floods after humans have destroyed the surrounding forests is an example of blank. A. Natural disaster. B. Man-made disaster. C. Hybrid disaster. D. Meteorological disaster. 14. Blank occurs when a large amount of ice or snow falls suddenly and quickly down a mountainside, causing a disaster. A. Avalanche. B. Drought. C. Bushfire. D. Volcano. 15. Blank occur due to differences in atmospheric pressure. A. Landslide. B. Drought. C. Flood. D. Cyclones. 16. The natural phenomena in which sudden release of energy in the Earth's lithosphere creates seismic waves is called as blank. A. Drought. B. Volcano. C. Earthquake. D. Avalanche. 17. During Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, highest number of deaths were reported in blank. A. India. B. Indonesia. C. Japan. D. Bangladesh. 18. The leakage of methyl isocyanate gas into the atmosphere lead to the disaster named blank. A. Chernobyl nuclear disaster. B. Bhopal gas tragedy. C. Fukushima nuclear disaster. D. Minamata chemical leak. 19. Leakage of blank gas in ambient air lead to Bhopal gas tragedy in India. A. Sulfuric acid. B. Methyl isocyanate. C. Benzene. D. Chlorine. 20. Release of liquid petroleum hydrocarbon by human activities into the marine environment leads to pollution of marine ecosystems, popularly called as blank. A. Tsunami. B. Flood. C. Avalanche. D. Oil spill. 21. Blank is not a characteristic of disaster. A. Borderless. B. Life loss. C. Expected event. D. Communication failure. 22. Disasters do not lead to blank. A. Afforestation. B. Outbreak of diseases. C. Physical injury. D. Severe stress. 23. The aims of disaster management are 1. Avoid or minimize potential losses after disaster. 2. Ensure prompt and reasonable assistance to the disaster victims. 3. Achieve effective recovery. 4. Shape the public policies and plans for better disaster management of 1, 2, 3. B. 1, 2, 4. C. 1, 3, 4. D. 1, 3. 24. A. Blank is essential to indicate the onset of disaster. A. Communication network. B. Disaster warning system. C. Community leadership. D. Disaster prevention. 25. Blank is the effort to reduce loss of life and property by reducing the impact of disasters. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster response. D. Disaster recovery. 26. Overcrowding in disaster relief camps lead a number of communicable diseases like blank. A. Malaria. B. Measles. C. Dengue. D. Cholera. 27. Blank involves all those activities that are required to avert disaster or avoid the gravity of loss. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster prevention. D. Disaster recovery. 28. Disaster management cycle works in phases in the order: A. 1. Prevention. 2. Mitigation. 3. Preparedness. 4. Response. 5. Recovery. B. 1. Prevention. 2. Mitigation. 3. Preparedness. 4. Recovery. 5. Response. C. 1. Prevention. 2. Response. 3. Preparedness. 4. Mitigation. 5. Recovery. D. 1. Preparedness. 2. Mitigation. 3. Prevention. 4. Response. 5. Recovery. 29. Making regulations regarding evacuation during disaster is blank. A. Structural disaster mitigation measure. B. Non-structural disaster mitigation measure. C. Structural disaster prevention measure. D. Non-structural disaster preparedness measure. 30. Building insurance is an example of blank. A. Structural disaster mitigation measure. B. Non-structural disaster mitigation measure. C. Structural disaster prevention measure. D. Non-structural disaster preparedness measure. 31. In blank, plans of action are developed to deal with the situation when the disaster strikes. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster prevention. D. Disaster recovery. 32. Blank involves measures designed to organize and facilitate timely and effective rescue, relief, and rehabilitation operations in case of disaster. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster prevention. D. Disaster recovery. 33. Necessary emergency services are mobilized during blank. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster prevention. D. Disaster response. 34. The aim of blank is to restore the affected area to its previous state. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster prevention. D. Disaster recovery. 35. Blank efforts attempt to prevent hazards from developing into disasters. A. Disaster mitigation. B. Disaster preparedness. C. Disaster response. D. Disaster recovery. Thank you for watching this video. Students, don't forget to subscribe this channel.